In our last lesson, we seen the peril of democracy in the United States. But what is the state of democracy worldwide? Well, today we have a wide-ranging set of guests. We're going to lead us through an overview of democracy in the world and then dive into specific case studies. We're going to explore the UK, Argentina, Russia, Ukraine, Hungary, India, and South Africa. Welcome to Democracy Discourse. I'm Brandon Stover, and I'm going to be your learning guide through Democracy Discourse. Now, this is not your standard course, one where I'm talking to you, instructing you the entire time, and you never give me any feedback about how you actually want to be learning. I want to hear from you about what it is that you want to learn in democracy. I want to have a conversation, a discourse, if you will, about what sort of questions are most salient to you around democracy. So to help with this process, as you watch this video and questions start to arise, please leave them in the comments below. And when the lesson is over, I want you to go over to our community tab on the channel and vote in our poll about what lesson you would like to learn next. By leaving comments, ones that I'm going to actually read, and voting in our poll, you can help to shape the direction of this course to make sure that you're actually learning what it is that you want to know about democracy most. Now, before we get to today's lesson, I want to introduce you to Louisa, which is the AI voice that I'll be using to help introduce certain speakers in all of our lessons and giving you prompts to periodically reflect on some of the material happening in the lesson. So Louisa, please introduce yourself and then introduce our first speaker.
Hello, everyone. I'm Louisa. I'll be helping Brandon with Democracy Discourse. The content we will be sharing with you today comes from the great guests we have had on the Democracy Group podcasts and lectures given at the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State. Our first speaker is Cathryn Grothe, a research analyst for Freedom House. She's going to give us a brief overview of the state of freedom globally from the Freedom in the World 2024 report.
Freedom in the world has been around now for over 50 years. And so every year it comes out with a full assessment of the state of freedom globally. Looking again currently at 210 countries and territories. So the most recent report we put out, that we call it Freedom in the World 2024. And perhaps unsurprisingly, like our kind of overall finding, one thing we're able to do by having all of this like country level indicator is look at, the global trends. Is freedom improving overall? Is it declining? Unfortunately, we found that freedom did decline again last year. This is actually the 18th year of consecutive declining freedom around the world. More countries are seeing net declines to their overall scores than net improvements. Last year, we looked at kind of two themes that were driving this decline. One was manipulation in elections, and then the other was armed conflict and repression of people who live often in disputed territories. So the election finding is still really relevant because, of course, 2024 is the year of elections. Hundreds of countries around the world are holding votes at the national level. So it was really kind of concerning to find that so many elections that happened last year have these kind of trends of, attacking opposition members, creating laws that sort of make an unlevel playing field that benefit incumbents, efforts to violently overturn election results. So this is something we found last year. And then again, given what's happening this year, we're kind of continuing to follow up and track some of those threats to the integrity of elections. And then the other thing we found last year that was really driving the decline is the armed conflict, specifically in kind of these disputed territories. So, of course, October 7th and the subsequent Israeli military campaign in Gaza comes after kind of a long, very arduous process of Israeli occupation in the West Bank. So we looked specifically at that. We also looked at other kind of disputed territories. One that may not be that familiar to people is Nagorno-Karabakh. This was a small enclave kind of between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Last September, Azerbaijan seized the entire territory, very violently expelled. I think it was 110,000 ethnic Armenians who had to flee back to Armenia and essentially took the territory as their own. So we were looking kind of at how people who live in these, disputed territories that are sometimes outside the bounds of international law, how their rights and freedoms are systematically undermined, often by a country or a government that is seeking to exercise territorial control. So those are the two findings, unfortunately, continue to be very relevant this year, and things we're continuing to look at.
And what threats do we see occurring?
So last year, we had this in a lot of countries are passing anti-LGBT plus legislation or really cracking down on things like marriage, expression of and personal identity. So this is something we've seen kind of increase this year, just the number of countries that have passed legislation that either, ban same-sex marriage or criminalize homosexuality. That is a really concerning trend, not just globally, but of course, kind of, this is something we'll be watching in the US as well. Although, to be fair, the US has not passed a draconian laws on this, but I think that's one thing that, around the world to keep an eye on. I think another that we're seeing kind of crop up is the weaponization of judiciaries or courts. So even, in the most not free places like Russia, Belarus, China, the judiciary is fully already under the control of the government, but we're seeing authoritarians in places like that, start to arrest people, lawyers or judges, the people who are kind of the last front in defending human rights and liberties and freedoms. But it's not just not free countries. We're also seeing kind of the politicization of courts in democracies as well. A couple of years ago, Poland had long couple of years of erosion of democratic institutions, one of which is the judiciary. This could happen by, the head of state either appointing judges that very much kind of align or who will just do their bidding. It could also happen, by undermining the separate checks and balances of the court. And again, this is something, we're keeping an eye on in the US, especially, in subsequent years, and it's really can the strong institutions that our country have continue to persist despite, leaders who may have intentions to do otherwise. So those are two things, these laws that criminalize sort of segments of the population, as well as efforts to weaken or undermine the independence of courts around the world. But I think, one thing that we try to do and that we see in every conversation is identify the right spots occurring in the world. In some places, it could be, I was talking about countries that are passing, bans on same-sex marriage. There are some countries that are legalizing it or we're seeing kind of an increase in social freedom in places in the world that you might not expect. Another one this year is just places that had, for the first time or relatively recently, very free and fair elections, or saw kind of the peaceful transfer of power. One that I like to highlight is Botswana, which just had elections and saw a huge win for the opposition, which essentially, peacefully changed power from the incumbent, who I think had held power for the last 20 years. So there are good things going on around the world.
Our next speaker is Matthew Rhodes Purdy, an assistant professor of political science at Clemson University and one of the authors of The Age of Discontent: Populism, Extremism, and Conspiracy Theories in Contemporary Democracies. He's going to define the underlying discontent in democracy that is being observed worldwide.
So discontent is, first of all, it's more intense than just sort of being upset with what's going on in the moment. It runs deeper than that. It's not oh, this policy is bad, or this leadership is bad, or this government is bad. It's everything's bad. All of the politicians are bad. All the populists are bad. We write that it is cumulative. Discontent builds over time as a result of repeated disappointments, in a sense that the situation is out of hand and there's no evidence that it's going to be able to right itself or be righted through normal democratic means. I think that's really the key one, is this idea that the normal mechanisms of democracy that are in place to change things when they're not going well are not functioning properly. And then the other really important one is just discontent is it's more intense. It's not, this is ill-advised or this is wrong-headed. It's, this is evil. There's a moral dimension to it that creeps in that you don't have with just the ordinary annoyances that we see in democracy.
In our last lesson of Democracy Discourse, we've seen this discontent occurring in the United States. But how is it showing up elsewhere? Rory Stewart, a former member of the British Parliament for over a decade, is going to describe the dysfunction of UK politics, painting them as rampant with cynicism, ignorance, glibness, incompetence, and many elected politicians, he says, don't know what they're doing or even voting on. Are things really that bad?
Yes, they're absolutely that bad. And I'm afraid they're pretty bad in most of the mature democracies in the world. The truth is that the basic mechanisms of democracy are the same in all our countries. We are driven by a particular media environment, by social media, by the necessity of campaigning and marketing and selling. And those things, and fundraising. I was talking to a US congresswoman who spends, she said, 110,000 hours in 2 years just on the phone, raising money. These things are not compatible with thinking seriously about policy. And those fundamental tensions are getting worse and worse.
How do you think that the UK system, which you described in such devastating detail, compares to the system over here in the US?
I think that there are, of course, differences, but fundamentally, the idea is the same. The idea is that a particular group, pretty small group of people, they might be called senators, congresspeople, they could be called cabinet ministers, somehow are going to be able to govern these incredibly complex societies. And the closer you get to who those people really are and how they actually spend their days, the things they're worrying about, the less plausible it is that this is a system which is likely to generate thoughtful, long-term policy.
As we move outside of traditional Western democracy, we can start to see the desired outcomes promised by democracy falling short in some countries. Veronica Gago, a professor of social science at the University of Buenos Aires and at the National University of San Martin, give a snapshot of Argentina under the current leadership of Javier Milei.
Well, we are in the midst of an economic catastrophe. Inflation record, massive layoffs in the public and private sector, budget cuts, but also cutting food supply to soup kitchens, for example, threat of defunding of the scientific system, defunding of universities, and the list could go on because every day is a new announcement of this kind of shock policies with a speed and violence that we have not seen in the democratic era in Argentina. I am analyzing this political logic from 3 key points: the capacity of destruction, the generation of chaos, and the display of cruelty. I think these terms are a sort of political grammar of this government that is completely new. I think there is a need to understand Milei's electoral victory and government as catalyzing the rejection of the precarity that existed before and that was made worse by the pandemic, but also by the inflation. Nevertheless, there have been important mobilizations, strikes, and protests. In other words, I want to underline, Argentina is not a society that passively accepts these ultra-neoliberal measures. At the same time, Milei still retains support, but I think many of his voters have already been disappointed by the effect of his measures because they are feeling in their everyday lives.
Beyond Argentina, we see other so-called democratic leaders using the very mechanisms of democracy to eliminate and erode its legitimacy. Let's hear from Donna Bari, Professor Emerita of Political Science at Penn State and an expert in Soviet and post-Soviet politics and democratization. She's going to give us a bleak picture of just how far Putin's leadership has gone in influencing Russia and Ukraine.
Russia in the 1990s was far more democratic than it is now. So Putin came to power at the end of the 1990s. He was appointed, right, as an interim president by the outgoing Boris Yeltsin in 1999. And Putin has made clear pretty much since the earliest days in office that he thought the 90s were a disaster. He thought Gorbachev was a disaster. Gorbachev's efforts, experiments at democracy in the Soviet Union led to economic collapse and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And for Putin, that's obviously a negative. Boris Yeltsin's efforts at democracy in the 1990s led to further economic collapse and almost to the breakup of Russia. So several provinces in Russia declared sovereignty. One declared independence. That was Chechnya. And Russia went to 2 wars to recapture Chechnya.
Right.
So for Putin, Western liberal democracy really does equate to disaster. And almost since the earliest point of his entry into office, he set out to reassert control over the media, over the legislature, over political parties, over business. And so what we've seen over time is gradual, but nevertheless persistent tightening of restrictions and controls.
And I'm curious about how you think of how absolute Putin's power is in in Russia. Are there sources of power that counter and can check him? Are there institutional checks on his power?
Not really.
Mhm.
He's been extremely adept, shall we say, at neutralizing those. So elections are manipulated, and Putin's party wins the majorities in the legislature. The courts are politicized and basically under the control of the executive. So the key counterweights, such as they might be, would be the wealthiest businesses, the oligarchs, so to speak, and the security services. And the oligarchs have been tamed, shall we say, ever since, again, the early days of Putin's administration. So they depend on him. That leaves the security services, the police, the various police our agencies, the military, and so on. And that would be that's the most central constituency. But whether they can act as a counterforce, maybe only if this war goes so badly and the sanctions bite so badly that being able to pay them and support them and being able to claim victory turns out to be a problem.
How do you think of Ukraine as a democracy?
Somewhere in the middle of the road between Soviet Union and Soviet politics and Soviet political system, and what we might think of as a consolidated democracy. Definitely not consolidated, for a number of reasons. Corruption being one of the biggest ones. That repeated episodes of corruption. But having said that, the governments in the last few years seem to have made more efforts to provide more effective public administration to address corruption. Our government in the last 2 to 3 years has made more progress also in reducing the levers of influence that the Kremlin, the Russian government, had in Ukrainian high politics. And so Ukraine has made halting progress, but you wouldn't call it consolidated democracy at this point.
What do you think its problems were going to be in terms of moving closer and closer to being a Western-style democracy?
Well, for one thing, it had an economic elite, we typically call them oligarchs, who had amassed massive wealth and who played an outsized role in politics to the point of being able to neutralize political reforms that we would consider necessary for consolidating democracy, particularly anti-corruption and the rule of law. And in many cases, the oligarchs, controlling a big business or several big businesses, industrial factories, media, controlling whole regions, meant that oligarchs could also control who would get elected to the legislature and also could weigh in on appointments into the executive branch, even judicial branch. So containing the oligarchs, the power of the oligarchs, has turned out to be a big issue. And governments since 2014 have made some progress on that. There have been a couple whose assets have been frozen and whose political power has been limited. So definitely rule of law, anti-corruption. And the other part is finding and neutralizing the Russian levers of influence. I mentioned earlier that President Putin and the administration equate democracy with disaster. That applies to neighboring post-Soviet countries as well as to Russia. For example, President Putin was very active in supporting a pro-Russian presidential candidate in Ukraine in 2004. Candidate ultimately lost. That was Yanukovych. But the point was that Ukraine at that point had a pro-democracy uprising that where people took to the streets against the rigging of an election. For Putin, that was a disaster. And so, and there have been other pro-democracy uprisings. Putin, in many cases, has advised the leaders in those cases, the leaders who were more pro-Russian and more authoritarian, just to use force to put down protests. So why be so concerned? Well, partly it's diffusion. A democratically oriented Ukraine is welcome for Russia with its, with a porous border and people who speak Russian who could go back and forth.
Turning democracy into an authoritarian state is a playbook being played out elsewhere, too. John Shattuck, former president and rector of Central European University, and current professor of practice in diplomacy at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, is going to share how Viktor Orban has played this out in Hungary.
What Viktor Orban has succeeded in doing, and we can talk about this more obviously, is eventually to turn a country that had the beginnings of a democracy and was doing reasonably well democratically into an authoritarian state by using the levers of democracy, the institutions of democracy, by basically taking over the country and taking over its institutions, taking control of the courts, the media, civil society, the legislature, and eliminating all the checks and balances. But nobody's in jail. There are no political prisoners. There's been so far no real use of violence. So this is not the same thing as a violent right-wing regime or a fascist regime in that respect. So the formula is really very dangerous. And it's a formula that I think it had in some ways been copied by other neo-authoritarians outside of Hungary. Orban has defined what he's doing in a very new way. He says he is building an illiberal democracy, but he claims that he is building a democracy, and in some ways he has a legitimate claim to that in the sense that he has been elected now. He's been elected twice, and actually 3 times if you consider his earlier election. And so he's using the major institution of democratic governance, which is an election, to seize power, to take power legitimately, but then to eliminate, and this is where the illiberal term that he uses comes in, to eliminate what are the basic elements of liberal democracy, and that is checks and balances, freedom of the media, independent judiciary, independent civil society, a pluralist governing system. Instead, he says, no, we're going to get rid of all that. He's quite open about it, although he does it through, school and legal, if you will, means by using his majority in the parliament to pass legislation which restricts the independence of the judiciary in various ways, and I can talk about that more detail. This is particularly dangerous because, as I say, it's kind of a velvet repression. It is simply taking over the instruments of government, shaping them to his own purposes.
But what of our star children of democracy, India and South Africa? While both have shown promise, democracy is experiencing turbulence there as well. Let's start by diving deep into the world's largest democracy, India. We'll first hear from Vinitha Yadav, an associate professor of political science and affiliate faculty in the School of International Affairs at Penn State.
India is a relatively new country. It's an old civilization, but it didn't really exist as a country before 1947. So the British colonized that part of Asia for about 200 years. And when they left, that territory was divided up into India and Pakistan. And India and Pakistan, the leaders gained experience under British colonial rule with parliamentary governance, because after the Government of India Act, there were elections, parties were allowed. And so the leadership of both of these countries actually had experience with elections. And so the parliamentary system was really something they were familiar with and had competed successfully in. And so that was adopted in India in 1950. And India has kept the same constitution, the same parliamentary system through its entire post-independence period. It's also one of the rare developing countries that has actually maintained a democratic regime for its entire existence. And the quality of that regime has varied quite a bit, but it has maintained itself as a democratic regime. It's a very robust multi-party system. It's always been a very robust multi-party system. It's got a very strong free press, again, something that changes over time. And I think one of the unique things about India is that voter turnout is actually higher in rural areas than it is in urban areas. And that tells you something about how deeply democratic values, norms, and practices have really sunk into ordinary citizenry. So there is this very deep understanding that we have the right to vote. And it's, and people do sell their votes, but they understand the value of the vote. So in many ways, it's a very robust democracy. In many ways, it's a very flawed democracy. I think it's definitely part of this larger global trend where democratically elected regimes are undoing a lot of the liberal protections and liberal rights and weakening institutions. So Poland, Hungary, Turkey, among developing countries. And in the last, I would say, 5 or 6 years, India has become part of that unfortunate trend. If you look back at history, it's not the first time this has happened in India. We had a period like this in the 1970s through the early 80s. But it's definitely, I would say, declining as a democracy right now.
And so thinking about the kind of strength of democratic norms, as you mentioned, people coming out in rural areas to vote, that all seems to have happened pretty quickly over generation, 2 generations at most from the time the country and the Constitution were established. Do you have a sense of how that spread and maybe how it spread so quickly or why it spread so quickly?
From 1947, when India gains independence, till about 1969, you have leaders who are genuinely committed to democracy. And so, we have a lot of theories about how political parties are sort of the school where voters and leaders are schooled into democratic values and practices. And I think India really demonstrates that. I think India was very lucky in having a good set of leaders who were genuinely committed to democracy.
Yeah. And so now thinking about Narendra Modi, is it safe to say that he does not share that same commitment or the strength of a commitment to democracy that maybe some of his predecessors had?
So I would say that Narendra Modi, the BJP, and the organizations and the movements associated with them have a very different vision of what a democratic society should look like in India. So they are committed to sort of the processes and the procedures of democracy, but not to the values of a liberal democracy, because they don't think Indians want liberal democracy. They don't think liberal democracy is appropriate given India's values. And again, this is their concept of what Indian values are.
Next, let's hear from Rahul Verma, a fellow at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, to help us further understand the breakdown of electoral democracy versus liberal democracy in India.
I would say that there are scholars who have actually noted this distinction between India's electoral democracy and liberal democracy. And I think what they are arguing that India is doing well or robust on the electoral democracy front, but the liberal elements of Indian democracy is under siege. But even those who identified the electoral democracy front, they had just stopped at, okay, elections are fine, they are competitive, BJP is winning and losing elections. So just saying that, there is electoral vibrancy. What I wanted to actually underline that behind this electoral vibrancy, what we are also witnessing is certain paradoxes. It's not just vibrant that you're just having elections. It's widely and deeply in certain respects. So in what sense is it widening or deepening? Basically, the turnout rates in India have been increasing. India does not have a compulsory voting system. Our turnout rates, which were somewhere around 58, 59% in early 2000s, in 2014, when BJP and Modi came to power for the first time, the turnout actually jumped by 6 percentage points. And in 2019, the turnout again jumped by 2.5 percentage points. So overall, the turnout is increasing. It also seems to be happening. India actually used to have a large gender gap, meaning that women were less likely to turn out. That gap was shrinking. But by 2014 and 2019, that gap has now narrowed down to 0.0%. Basically, in some cases, women have started turning out more in numbers. More people are contesting, more parties are contesting. So it's expanding. The deepening is happening as representation in the cabinet has widened. Now you have many more segments that are getting ministries and ministry representatives. The president of India and the last president of India come from very sort of like marginalized communities. And I can quote certain examples. Now, one side can basically make this argument that this is all symbolism and there is nothing substantive about it. But if it's happening at so many levels, can we simply just dismiss it? Should we not acknowledge this expansion widely and try to understand why this is happening, what this might be doing to our party politics, and what this might be doing to our democracy?
But how is India's democratic history going to fare going forward? Let's hear from Radha Kumar, an independent researcher and political analyst based in Delhi and a member of the governing board of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, as she explains the 3 waves of democracy renewal in India and what a 4th wave might look like.
When I've looked at what I call the 3 waves of democracy renewal in India, that is 1977 to 1980, when you had a coalition of anti-Congress opposition parties coming into power. Then you have the second wave, which is 1989 to 1998. What is common to all 3 of these waves is that civil society mobilized. Curiously, however, industry which has to invest in helping democratic institutions consolidate, has not ever done so. And that, I think, is one of the big major flaws, which explains why Indian democracy has decayed so often and so frequently. However, the second thing that I saw, which gave me great hope and which was kind of surprising, in that I hadn't heard other people mention it, was that I discovered that all three of these waves, welfare legislation, was very high. It reached almost 40 to 50% of all legislation. Whereas in the periods of decay, and certainly under the Modi administration, welfare legislation was very low. It sank to a low. So that's a, absolutely black and white contrast, which ought to be used by the democratic political parties, even though they don't. Then your point about the Congress. People talk a great deal about dynasty in the Congress. I would say that perhaps a greater problem, which, sad to say, cuts across all political parties in India, is that there is no inner party democracy. Indira Gandhi destroyed the Congress's local branches and the system that existed prior to her coming into power of the district branches voting in the leadership rung by rung up to the top. That system went entirely. Now, if we look, there is not a single party which has inner party democracy of any sort. Almost all of them are one-person shows.
So if I may try to summarize much of what you've taught me today, the lessons I'm taking are that there is reason for hope that there could be a democratic revival in India, but it's not coming from the major parties. It's coming from below, and it's coming from the margins, and it's coming from the corners of India. It's coming from the different languages, the different cultures, and the different religions, all of which are perhaps tired of seeing their country overwhelmed by a cartoonish vision of Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, and an emphasis on a single language, a single religion, a single script, etc. And now there may be, coming from below, from the farmers, for instance, a sense that it is time to energize democracy with new spirits and then let the new parties emerge from that. Does that seem like a reasonable description of the next 10 years of India?
I think that there's no doubt at all any fourth wave of democracy, a renewal, will come from the social movements, the farmer and peasant movements, the workers' movements, the women's movements, and obviously the environmental movement, which is growing larger and larger.
Finally, let's visit South Africa. We'll first hear from Cyan Loyal, Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at Penn State, and a Global Fellow at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo. She's going to walk us through the development of the last 30 years of democracy in South Africa.
One of the things that draws me to South Africa as a country and as a case for thinking about democracy's survival, but also democracy death, is actually how successful it has been. Right? So many people in 1994 were deeply concerned about the prospects of civil war, of revolt or revolution from either the white or the black population. And while we're going to talk a lot today about the challenges that South Africa has faced, we have not seen democratic collapse, right? I mean, so the history of South Africa is a long and complicated history. But it's worth noting that it's an area that's very culturally diverse, ethnically diverse. It's very rich in natural minerals, in diamonds, in oil. And the story of South Africa, at least when it comes to understanding apartheid, really begins with the colonization of the area by Dutch immigrants. They took over the land from a number of indigenous tribes that had been in the area since the dawn of human history. The British eventually became economically interested in the area and fought a civil war with the Dutch and won. So there's both British and Dutch influence, colonial influence in the area. But it wasn't until kind of after that conflict had ended that the government really started to think about how best, or the colonial government started to think about how best to rule over an overwhelmingly large minority Black and colored population. So the political system that the government came up with in order to kind of keep control over this large African indigenous population was a system of apartheid. And that was the separation of white, Black, and colored South Africans from each other. It involved the creation of townships, of segregated education, of segregated jobs, and really concentrated the power, both economically and politically, within the whites in the country. It was a deal that was struck between the British and the Dutch in order to, or what had ended up becoming the Afrikaner population, between the British and the Afrikaners, to really maintain control over the country. Apartheid lasted for decades, and it wasn't until 1994 that we saw the overthrow of that regime after a white referendum 2 years before that encouraged the current apartheid government to negotiate with the then very strong opposition party, the ANC, led by Nelson Mandela. But I think it's worth remembering that the process of democratization in South Africa took many years, right? So we can start at 1990, for example, when Nelson Mandela was released from prison and really began aggressively negotiating but on behalf of the ANC with the apartheid government about what a potential democratic transition would look like. We can go back decades before then when we think about the struggle of activists like Ankie Krog, who were advocating for kind of human rights, representation, and equality way earlier on. There are so many kind of heroes and inspirational people who were involved in the process. But one of the components of this negotiation that took place between 1990 and 1994 was wrestling with exactly these questions, Chris, which is how does a country that has been so divided and so ignorant of each other for so long kind of come together to form a democracy in which you need to find common good and common ground and a greater understanding of people. One of the ideas that was then put forward was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the idea behind the commission was that people were going to come forward all over the country from all different backgrounds and talk about the experiences that they had with apartheid.
But what does democracy viscerally feel like for those who experience its struggles of coming to fruition? More importantly, will South Africa's democracy continue? South African writer and scholar Ankie Krog may have some answers.
I think the excitement started in 1990 when Nelson Mandela was released, when the ANC was unbanned. There was a lot of excitement because it was as if myths were coming alive. You knew about the names, but you've never seen the people. You've never heard them. You don't know what they said because they were all banned. And suddenly, there they all were. So the excitement was already then that we are on the road to the end of something and on the road to something wonderfully new. And when they started to draft the interim constitution in order to, in the end, guide the election, there were a lot of mishaps. There's the assassination of Chris Hani and lots of killing. More people were killed between 1990 and 1994 than in the past 30 years from 1960 to 1990. So it was a vicious time, but it was a time also of unity for people who wanted something new. So, but it was always fraught. You never knew what the army, because the white army was completely in control. The white police, a very effective police force, was completely in control. The civil service, so the country was run by the old political party, by the white party. And you knew that they were working with particular black groups in order to prove that black people kill other black people. So don't think you are safe because you're white, because they don't even care for their own people. So it was turmoil, it was fraught, so we were all nervous. But then that day was like we saw the best face of ourselves right from the beginning. And I remember about everyone went to vote where you could mix with other people. So not necessarily in your own area where only white people could vote, but we went out to the township to vote there. And then, because some of the voting stations didn't work well in the township, buses of people were, so it was a mixture and singing, and it was a wonderful moment.
Yeah, and so if you think about that sort of high point moment that you described in 94 with this, feeling of unity, the kind of celebratory aspect, where do things stand now, and what has the trajectory over the past 30 years been like as far as the strength or the health of democracy in the country?
I would say that maybe we were not vigilant enough. Maybe we were too trusting. Maybe we were not changing sufficiently. But we all believed that we will muddle through in a way. There will be things working not here and things falling apart there. But in the end, we will get through. But where we are now is so close to disaster.
that the question is often being asked, for how long will this peace, why are South Africans not at each other's throats? Why are we not the war makers of one of these terrible wars? Why is it not happening there? And you must remember the war between white and black has been suspected right from 1994, when the whole world came to South Africa to see the election and see how it's going to become a crisis. And then the killing happened in Rwanda and not with us. So it's been expected for now. So why isn't it happening? And we are being described as a failed state. The poverty is worse than ever. The inequality is worse than ever. In one way, I want to say, South Africans live cheek to cheek with poverty. We see it on a daily basis. Not once, but all the time. You're aware of the poverty, the hunger, and the suffering. But the fact that you live in parts of America, or that you live in Sweden, or that you live in Cape Town, expensive, and you don't see that, does not mean it does not exist, and it does not mean it's not coming from you as well. So one of the many problems South Africa has is that our context is a Western capitalist context. And everyone wants to live like the people we see on TV. We want safe houses, we want fridges full of food, we want a smart carafe with whiskey. We all want that. But in fact, the world cannot sustain it. So some people have to madly protect what they have and deprive the others. So that tension that we live with is actually a worldwide tension. So when people go in boats to Europe, when people cross walls in America, I say yes, because how else will we get a more equal planet?
Having heard all of that today, what do you think the state of democracy is? Please comment below your thoughts after hearing today's lesson. I'd also like to know what sort of questions have been brought up for you around democracy. We have a poll going on right over on our community tab, where you can go vote on our next lesson. So if you have specific questions, drop them in the comment or go over to that poll and vote on the next lesson. And if you don't see the topic that you would like to explore, leave a comment and I will be sure to include it in the next poll. Thank you so much for your time and attention.